As the 1800s continued, Thomas Jefferson was no longer president. We had fought a war against England from 1812 to 1815 while James Madison was president. And a new president, also from Virginia, would come up to continue this Virginia dynasty, named James Monroe. Now, this was the post-war of 1812 period, as I mentioned, and it would become known as a somewhat era of good feelings. A period when nationalism would definitely start to grow. We no longer had to look at conflicts in other places. Foreign policy didn't dominate our decisions. Instead, we could turn inward and focus on domestic policies. But the questions of the powers in our Constitution would continue to be tested. And a battle between what authority the federal government has compared to the state governments would show itself. Now, we would also see questions to deal with commerce and the federal government's right to regulate commerce. Questions that would deal with contractual issues on the federal and state levels. But it's in 1819 that another major court case would develop to deal with that question of federalism, authority between the federal and the state governments. It's also at this time that era of good feelings kind of flipped and became the era of bad feelings. Because in 1819, a financial panic had swept across our country. It was the first financial panic. Now, we had had tough times with debt when George Washington took over, and Alexander Hamilton was able to implement some new policies to deal with that crisis before it could reach the levels of a panic. And today, we have our own crisis in our economy that have reached beyond a panic to a recession. And we know that during the 1930s, we had another major economic crisis that reached beyond a recession, all the way to depression. But this panic of 1819 was the first. But as you can see, as you take a look at what problems were occurring, they seem to be very similar to the problems we are facing today. Trade from different countries would almost come to a halt. All that growth that we had after we had turned inwards after the War of 1812 and started developing some of our manufacturing would come to almost a halt. Because of that, people would start to lose their jobs and unemployment would rise up. As they lost their jobs, mortgages would be foreclosed on, and they would lose their land and lose their houses. Farmers were going to suffer from the fact that the products that they were creating, the commodities they were growing, would have prices that would drop, meaning they no longer could make enough money for survival. And then there were the banks. The banks, private and national, that held on to these mortgages, that held on to these loans, that helped finance those early companies that were initiating trade. They started to make calls on those loans, looking for people to pay back what they owed, even in gold and silver. And the banks began to fail when the people couldn't pay those things back. And our migration to our new western lands in the Ohio River Valley also started to stall. That was an opportunity for people to reach out and pursue their happiness. That was an opportunity for our government to pay off its debts by selling that land. But because of the panic in our economy, because of the failures and the unemployment, those sales collapsed and slowed down. It's in this context that states had to look to other ways to deal with this problem. And one problem that kept rising up was, how do we deal with the pauperism that's starting to spread? The increased number of poor living in our cities. Well, we could turn to the churches as part of their faith to help out the poor. We could turn to the wealthy who could afford to give to the poor. And these poor are not going to sit still for long. They're going to look out to blame. Find out what is the cause of this panic and desire a remedy. And their protests are going to turn towards the government first. They start believing that the government is spending too much money and that it's costing too much to run this government. And then they turn outward. And to protect our fledgling industry, they determined that we must demand protection against foreign competition so that we can sell and produce goods here in America. And states will turn to question the authority of the powers of our federal government. And in the case from 1818 to 1819 of McCulloch versus Maryland, we see this played out in the courts. Now, it started off with the state of Maryland determining that they need to tax the national bank that is located in Maryland. McCulloch happens to be the man who manages that national bank. And when the national bank fails to pay its tax levied by the state, then it's brought to the courts. And then it is appealed. And again, McCulloch is convicted of not paying these taxes. And here's that in this court case, a state has been brought into the case. Therefore, there's a question of who has the jurisdiction over this court case. And we found out from Article 3 that that's the judicial branch. Then there's the other side of this court case. The idea is that, was this national bank actually constitutional to begin with? Could the federal government have created such a national bank? And if it could it be taxed? And that's the first question that the Supreme Court will have to answer. Is the national bank constitutional? Well, there is that portion in Article 6 of our Constitution that gives the notion that the federal law is the supreme law of the land. And Marshall starts to conclude that that means our Constitution is a living Constitution. A document, as you can see, that is intended to endure for ages to come, and therefore, consequently, will need to be adapted according to the crises that are faced. Marshall then turns to Article 1, the legislative branch, and to Section 8, at the end of the list of the powers the Constitution grants to our Congress. And he cites the necessary and proper clause, which states that in order to use those powers granted by the Constitution, the legislature can create laws, agencies, and so forth that are deemed necessary and proper in order to use those powers. So therefore, John Marshall once and for all declares that the National Bank is constitutional. And then that leads to the second part of the question. Therefore, does Maryland have the power as a state to interfere with congressional powers? Well, this federal authority is going to be interpreted by our Supreme Court under John Marshall that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. So therefore, by the state of Maryland, by taxing the national bank, that is giving them the power to destroy the national bank. And as Marshall has already stated, that Congress and our federal government has the power to create and preserve the national bank. So therefore, we find that in McCulloch versus Maryland, and through the powers of judicial review that were granted from Marbury versus Madison, Maryland does not have the does not have the authority to tax a federal creation. And once again, not only is John Marshall establishing the power of the judicial branch, being certain that our checks and balances do work, he's also answering the question of federalism. What powers are actually granted or delegated to the federal government? And therefore, which powers are reserved for the states? But when one interacts with the other, the Supreme Court must rule on the constitutionality of those actions. And in McCulloch versus Maryland, John Marshall ruled that Maryland did not have the power to tax the national bank.